University, Diona Vigil, and Rupali Lamaye, and Sophia Nunier. So welcome, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Michelle. I'll go ahead and share my screen, and then Sophie will start us off.
So, Ayuki, everyone. My name is Sophie Neuner. I am a member of the Karuk tribe and a research associate at the Johns Hopkins Center for American Indian Health. My colleagues Dee and Rupali and I are really excited to be here with you all. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the unceded lands that Johns Hopkins University occupies. They are of the Piscataway and Susquehannock Nation. I currently am phoning in from my own ancestral territory. I am from Penomnik, which is a community located in Northern California, otherwise known as Orleans. It's a very small but beautifully located village. And I would also like to acknowledge that many of us on this call are calling in from Albuquerque, which is on Tiwa Pueblo land. So welcome everybody from all of our beautiful Indian country. And we are very excited to talk about building vaccine confidence to increase uptake of COVID-19 vaccines in our communities today. All right, next slide. Yes, so today's presenters are the wonderful Diona Virgil and Rupali Lamaya. They will both introduce themselves really briefly, if possible.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Rupali Lamay. It's great to be here. So I work at the International Vaccine Access Center at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and I lead our behavioral and implementation science work, and I've been working in vaccine behaviors for about 6 to 7 years. Thank you for having us.
Umbiak gini singit samu everyone na kama Diana Vihil na vito kama over goyo na nambe wingelta. My name is Diana Vihil, or D for short, and I'm from Nambe Pueblo, New Mexico, which is where I'm at currently. And I'm a research program coordinator with the Center for American Indian Health, and I work on our infectious disease prevention programs. And thank you for having us today.
All right, so for today's objectives, we're going to collectively understand the motivations and drivers of vaccine hesitancy and really talk about how this impacts COVID-19 vaccine uptake in our communities. We also would like to talk about the role of community health representatives in building vaccine confidence and keeping all of our communities safe. And then furthermore, we'd like to discuss communication approaches on how to combat vaccine hesitancy in our communities. Dee and Rupali will be walking you guys through the bulk of the presentation. You'll hear from me a little bit later, and I'm really excited to learn with you all.
All right, so here's a roadmap to building vaccine confidence, and we'll discuss these more as we get through, but we'll start off with an overview of COVID-19 and vaccination, and then we'll talk about drivers of vaccine hesitancy and vaccine acceptance in the context of COVID-19. Then we'll discuss some ways to communicate effectively about vaccines, and then go over some common COVID-19 vaccine FAQs. All right, so just to start with an overview, I'm sure many people are these fundamentals get lost at this stage in a pandemic, and so or maybe they were never gone over. And so COVID-19 is the disease that is caused by SARS-CoV-2, which is the name of the coronavirus that everyone is seeing right now. And there are different variants, but that's the virus that causes the disease. And SARS, many people may have heard of before, maybe in the early 2000s. And it is spread person to person via respiratory droplets. And so when you're talking, coughing, singing, we expel droplets and the virus stays in those, and they can land on surfaces or stay in the air, and others can bring them in. And people who are asymptomatic or have no symptoms or have mild symptoms can still spread infection. So that's really important to know. I think there's some misconceptions about that, but regular testing is really important so that you know if you're positive or not and can take the appropriate next steps. Some symptoms of COVID-19 include fever, cough, trouble breathing, and sometimes it can include aches, pains, nasal congestion, runny nose, sore throat, diarrhea, tiredness, and loss of taste and smell. And for most people who are asymptomatic, their first sort of sign that they might have COVID is the loss of taste and smell. And up to 1/3 of COVID-19 survivors have long-term effects. And we're still trying to understand what those effects exactly are and who is more prone to getting long-term effects of COVID-19, but they do exist. And there's a lot of active research on that right now. Some risks for COVID-19 infection do differ by race, ethnicity, age, location. So here are American Indians and Alaska Natives who are non-Hispanic. And as you can see, our cases are pretty high, or our risk for infection, hospitalization, and death is much higher than other groups of individuals. And how do vaccines work? Well, usually when you get a natural infection, your body develops germ fighters or antibodies to fight infection, and vaccines work in a very similar way. What we hear about now with these mRNA vaccines is they actually give our cells the instructions to create the spike protein that sounds the alarm, which you can see here, that tells our body that there is a threat and we need to build something to fight it. And so we build these fighter cells and proteins called antibodies, and they're able to stop the virus from infecting our cells and causing disease. Here is where we are with COVID-19 vaccines, and this is worldwide. So it might look a little bit confusing because it says that there are 6 vaccines approved for full use, but these are in other countries. And so there are, I believe, 4 are approved in China for full use. And Moderna is approved in Switzerland for full use, and Pfizer is approved in several other countries for full use. But in the United States, we only have 3 that are approved for emergency use right now, and those are Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. And Rupali will talk a little bit more about those. How do we get these vaccines to this stage? Well, they have to go through clinical trials, and the traditional layout of that is that there are 3 phases, and they happen, one after another whenever we have enough safety and efficacy evidence. And we start out in a small group of people, study that, and then we have a bigger group of people. And there we're looking at immune response and monitoring for any safety concerns. And if that all looks good, then it goes on to phase 3, and that can be 1,000 plus people. And then that looks at, okay, well, phase 2, we know that there's immune response. We know that there's no safety concerns. We'll still monitor safety concerns, but now we want to understand how does this work at preventing infection. And so that's what phase 3 looks at. And with COVID-19, that usually takes a long time, but with these COVID-19 vaccines, the steps weren't skipped, but they were instead overlapped. And so you have a whole team of people dedicated to looking at these things in real time, looking at data, monitoring safety and things like that. And so we're able to overlap these steps so that way and everything is still being looked at in the same way it would. It's just happening faster and in real time. And so that's how we were able to get vaccines so quickly. And I'll hand it over to Rupali to talk more about the vaccine options right now.
Thank you so much, Dee. As Dee mentioned, we had some great news actually just from this weekend that Johnson & Johnson was approved for EUA, emergency use authorization, here in the United States. So some of the things that we're currently dealing with now is helping states determine allocation and prioritization. If we look at these vaccines side by side, if you all remember, Pfizer and Moderna essentially were approved for EUA in November, I believe, and went essentially to the market starting in December, primarily with healthcare workers. And the way I would think about Pfizer as well as Moderna is they're pretty interchangeable, if you will. They're both based on a platform, an mRNA platform. There's 2 doses. Efficacy is very similar with regards to about 95% effectiveness. The Johnson & Johnson product, we just heard this weekend that was approved for EUA. So that is based on a virus vector is the vaccine that is developed off of. Now, with regards to protection, they had different endpoints. And so it's essentially, I think, comparing sort of apples to oranges, if you will. But I think the most important point from the Johnson & Johnson product for people to communicate is this idea is that it was found to be 85% protective against severe COVID. It was also being tested while these variants were circulating, which we'll talk about a little bit more. So those are the 3 current products here approved for use in the United States. If we can go to the next slide. Great. So a couple of things with regards to how did the rollout happen, particularly here in the United States. So as you can all imagine, demand is really way more than supply at the current moment. And many of us that really thought about prioritization as well as allocation really spent time thinking about which groups were most at risk for exposure. So essentially, with regards to early vaccination, again, in this limited supply context, it was important to really focus on healthcare, of course, essential workers that are working in critical industries. In addition, individuals that are at high risk for severe COVID, that tends to be individuals that might have respiratory ailments, and then as well as those that are in the older populations, if you will. If we go to the next slide. One thing in terms of how this has happened, I think many of you represent a number of different states. I personally I'm living in Virginia. The reason I think this has been so confusing in a lot of ways is that it is determined at the state level with regards to allocation as well as rollout. So in some states, you will see things like mass vaccination where there are stadiums, individuals sign up for an appointment, they get a vaccine. In addition, there's also routine clinical appointments that you can sign up for. And then again, for those that are homebound, it's important to think about home visits. And that's essentially also including the long-term care facility population, which were really a priority. We go to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about vaccine hesitancy and what are some of the drivers that we are seeing within the COVID context. I first want to comment and say that vaccine hesitancy is something that is on a spectrum, meaning a vaccine behavior isn't just yes or no. So the way that we define and we conceptualize and talk about hesitancy are individuals that either delay or refuse a vaccine, or individuals that accept a vaccine, but do so and have questions. So it's really a continuum of behaviors, if you will. Now, the argument would be here, as we started to see that COVID-19 vaccines were going to be produced and were going to be on the market, the important thing from my perspective as someone that works in vaccine behavior is how can we assure the public that vaccine recommendations that we are making really reflect data, are data-driven, and reflect scientific knowledge. Part of the issue as to why this has been so challenging with regards to why we're seeing hesitancy here in the United States is that we are in a time of crisis. We've been living in uncertainty for a full year now, if you can believe it. So there's a lot of scientific uncertainty. There has been changing recommendations. From a public health perspective, that means that we're learning something and we're updating recommendations to reflect that learning. From the public perspective, it is seen as confusing. The other issue that we have been facing with, particularly over the last year during the vaccine development process, is that politicians, rather than scientific experts, really have been the public face of the crisis. And that has caused a huge challenge with regards to how to communicate correctly and accurately about vaccines. The other issue that we are very much facing is a misunderstanding of Operation Warp Speed. Part of that has to do with the fact that I think Dee spoke about is that even though it was an expedited process, there were no corners cut essentially from a regulatory perspective, but many individuals are concerned because it was an expedited process and therefore assume that maybe the vaccine isn't safe. So if we go to the next slide. As I just mentioned, just to reiterate, vaccine acceptance is a spectrum. So individuals that you all are working with closely in your communities, it's not binary. It's not, yes, I'll take a vaccine, or no, I won't take a vaccine. Is that individuals might take some vaccines and reject others and whatnot. We go to the next slide. And I think this is back over to you, Dee.
Thank you. So here we're just talking about in a global study on hesitancy toward COVID-19 vaccine, about 7 out of every 10 people would agree to get the vaccine, which is really good. And so you can see here that this sort of shows what Rupali was just talking about. Here are folks who completely agree, and that's a larger percentage. Some folks completely disagree, and that's a shorter percentage. Some people somewhat disagree, and those people, could kind of go either which way depending on information. Then you have a decent amount of people who have a neutral or no opinion, and then other people that somewhat agree, but again, could go anyway on the spectrum as new information comes or they hear different things. So it's really important that as people in the community who are trusted health people, that we help to move them towards a way that is safer for them and the community. And it changes over time. And so, as I just mentioned, as new information comes or perceptions and fears can change, and people can have different attitudes. And some people that I've heard in my community specifically is that they'll say, well, I'm not against the vaccine, but because it happened so fast, I'm not going to get it right away. Let's let other people get it. And then we'll see what happens, and then maybe I'll get it after. And so they just want to sort of do their own research in that way as well. And so here it is how just a graph of kind of how things have changed. And you can kind of see where when politicians come into play, how vaccine confidence sort of falls. And that's can be really scary. And we've seen that on a national level, as well as in many cases in local levels as well, or in our own tribes. All right, and so here it's really important to understand the sources of distrust and not to just shame people for not getting a vaccine or shame them for not having access to certain information or not being open to hearing that kind of information. Rather than doing that, it's really important to understand where these sources of distrust come from and just being empathetic and trying to provide, combat or how to have those type of discussions when people do have that hesitancy. But as many of you know on this call, we have a long history with the United States government that's not good, and many of our tribes and Native people in general have not had good relationships with researchers or anybody who comes into our communities and exploits us, or just does things for their own benefit, or has this sort of attitude of they know better, they're smarter, and have a very extractive way of building relationship with communities. And so there's that, but then there's also the ongoing systems of racism and disparities, and those show up in, I would say, sometimes less explicit ways now, but you see them in policies that come out or laws that come out, or when different administrations come in and it's budget time and CHR funding gets cut yet again, and IHS funding gets cut again, and so those are just ways that we're still put in places of disadvantage. And so some perceptions in Native communities are actually pretty good. People talk a lot about the mistrust and things like that, but as we're having more information available and vaccine information is more accessible to communities, more people are willing to get it, and usually it's because they want to protect their community and themselves and their families. And so this was a study done by the Urban Institute, or survey done by the Urban Institute of Indian Health, and 75% of the people who took this survey were willing to receive a COVID vaccine. And so that's pretty good. And it's pretty high. It's good to note that people who are willing to take this survey might be the same people more willing to take the vaccine versus other people. So you might expect higher incidence, but nonetheless, it's still good numbers to see. Some of the main drivers of vaccine hesitancy in Native communities are listed right here. And so of the 25% of people who were not willing to get the vaccine, they said that they thought vaccines moved through trials too quickly, which is something that we mentioned. They thought COVID vaccines were dangerous. And a lot of that has to do with not quite understanding how the mRNA platform works and this sort of idea that it will interact with our DNA or mess with our genes or something like that. And that's not true. And I believe Sophie might address that in the FAQs later. But they also thought that vaccines were inadequately tested for safety and effectiveness. And as I mentioned, some people might want to do their own research. Let me wait to see how it plays out in the population before getting it. And then there's fear of potential side effects. Some people have absolutely no side effects of the vaccine, and some people, like myself, had fever and chills for 2 days, and my mom actually had nausea, fever, and chills for 2 days, but my grandparents, nothing. So it all just depends on the person. And of those willing to get the vaccine, 90% found COVID to be a serious threat. I'm sorry, unwilling. So they were unwilling to get the vaccine, even though they thought COVID was a serious threat. And even though they thought they were at risk for infection. And a lower percentage said that they would receive the vaccine at some that's good. We want people to get vaccinated eventually, even if it doesn't have to be right now. And both those willing and unwilling to get the vaccine shared similar concerns about side effects and safety testing concerns. And so the more that we can provide important information from a trusted source, the more we can help to combat that. And vaccines questions and concerns are normal, and as they should be. I think everyone should really be critical about everything around them, from research to their healthcare to medications or treatments or preventative measures like vaccines. And vaccine hesitancy can turn into vaccine confidence or vaccine refusal. So as I said, those people who are somewhat okay with the vaccine or somewhat disagree with the vaccine can go really either which way. And so we really want to do what we can to help move them away from vaccine refusal. And CHRs play a really valuable role in that. My mom is a CHR for our pueblo, and she is not a nurse or anything like that, but people call her all the time for questions and is this okay, or can I take this with my medication, or different stuff like that. And so you really do play such an important role in helping people feel more confident to get the vaccine. And the primary, as I mentioned before, the primary motivation for participants who were willing to get the vaccine was just a strong sense of protection for themselves, their families, and their community. They understand that the more we can protect our community, the more we can preserve our cultural ways. We can move on out of this pandemic and start having ceremonies again and teaching our young ones those ways. And so that's really exciting to at some point be able to do that again. And back to you, Rupali.
Thank you so much, Dee. So just to continue to talk about hesitancy, I want to talk very briefly about some of the issues that we had heard with folks that were hesitant pre-COVID. So again, before the pandemic. The main concerns that we have heard, and I've worked mostly with childhood and pediatric vaccines, but the main concerns were related to ingredients. Parents have concerns about what went into vaccines. Another concern was the idea of the vaccine schedule. I think many of you know, when kiddos are born, they have lots of different vaccine appointments at 0 to 4, 6 months. People had concerns about that. There's also this misperception that continues to persist between vaccines and severe adverse events such as autism, although this has been refuted soundly through multiple studies. This continues to be an issue that we speak with. There's also an issue of low levels of risk perception, and risk perception is made up of two things: is susceptibility. Do you think you're susceptible to the disease? And severity. Do you think the disease is severe enough so that it will warrant you to get a vaccine? And the other piece that has really happened is this long history, I would say, of historical and current mistreatment and mistrust of researchers as well as the federal government. We can go to the next slide. How that has changed, we've heard some different arguments now within the context of COVID. So the first still focuses on distrust and really a lack of confidence, and that has to do with essentially how quickly the vaccines were developed, as well as individuals that participated in the clinical trial process, whether or not they were truly representative of the population. Misinformation has become a huge challenge for many of us working in this space. While social media has been a great source of information for many people, it has also led to a lot of misinformation, particularly related to vaccines. We're also seeing what I would call a polarization of attitudes. And what I mean by that is 20 years ago, we had more agreement generally among the population that vaccines were agreed upon as a scientific-based therapeutic intervention that showed high rates of effectiveness. However, that has changed over time, and now we are starting to see more and more polarization. And this image that you're seeing here is that we're essentially looking at a cluster of something on a Facebook page that was one day in 2019. And the red dots essentially represent individuals that hold anti-vaccination attitudes. The blue dots represent individuals that hold pro-vaccine attitudes. And the green dots are those that are undecided. What's interesting and what we're continuing to see, if we look at this from a network perspective, is that we're starting to see that the those that are pro-vaccine and those that are anti-vaccine are very, very far apart compared to 20 years ago when there was a bit more of entanglement. The problem with that is that that means that not only do outbreaks cluster, but we see attitudes related to vaccines also cluster. So the reasons that we're having outbreaks is because we are unfortunately unable to really interject and intervene within these clusters of perhaps neighborhoods, of communities that might hold anti-vaccine sentiment, for example. If we go to the next slide. Great. The other piece that we're continuing to see, as I mentioned, is misinformation. Dictionary.com in 2018 called misinformation the word of the year, and there's a distinct difference here that we have been studying. So when people spread misinformation, they believe the information they are sharing. However, disinformation is crafted and disseminated with the intent to mislead others. So an example I can give you is that if a political leader claims that COVID-19 is no worse than the flu, despite knowing that this is not true, that is disinformation because it's crafted and disseminated with the intent to mislead. But when an individual might hear this, believes it, and then shares it, that would be misinformation. So how should we communicate about the vaccine? I'm going to turn it back over, I think, to Dee for some of these slides, and I will come in, I think, a bit later on. So back over to you, Dee.
Cornerstones of communication are trust, and it's so important to have that trust before an outbreak like this happens, you know, and to have those relationships built. And that's where CHRs also are so vital, is because usually CHRs have been in the community for a really long time, and they already have that trust with the community. And so trust, announce early, be transparent, and listen. I think Pfizer figured out pretty early that it was really important to be transparent, and they have a section on their website that just talks about their processes and data and things like that in an effort to be more transparent. And then just listen. It's just hearing. Sometimes people just need to talk out however they're feeling about vaccine or anything like that. And you just listening to them can be really helpful, and not to change their mind, but just to give them that space. And sometimes people even talk themselves out of, you know, whatever they were thinking before, or talk themselves into something else, just all on their own. So that's really important. And here's just more of a breakdown of maintain and restore trust between the public and those managing the outbreak. And it is unstable. So if I cut out, I'm really sorry. Just let me know. But for this, sometimes we are the people managing the outbreak who are outside of the community, and sometimes we're in the community, but sometimes we're people who can connect both. And so it's really important to understand where you fall in that spectrum and then move forward accordingly. Announce early. Proactive communication, even with incomplete information, is crucial. So it's really important to be honest about what you don't know, but be confident about what you do know. And then when more information is known, later on, have another conversation and go on from there. Transparency, again, maintaining public trust requires being transparent. When we're not transparent, we allow people to come to their own conclusions. And sometimes those conclusions are wrong or harmful or misleading. But because there's no information to say otherwise, that's the information that gets carried forward. And then listening. And we already talked about that one. But it's important to listen to also what the community needs. And so when you're having, or maybe you're hearing a lot of people calling you saying, I don't trust the vaccine because X, Y, and Z. Well, then now you know, I'm getting a lot of calls from this age group, and they're similarly all not trusting the vaccine because of these three reasons. How do we shift our messaging to one, appeal to them, and two, the appropriate information for them to rely on or go back to? And Rupali, I'll give this back to you.
Okay, thanks so much. I think Dee is having, I think, some challenges. There we go. So to just continue on that, in terms of how do we communicate to increase trust, we have done quite a bit of work in this area to figure out how do we reduce hesitancy, and that's really through the building of trust. One thing I think that is very clear, and I think sometimes is hard for folks to really wrap their head around, is to not correct misperceptions. I think the instinctive response is when we hear something that is not correct, is for us to automatically correct that information. However, we have found that that can lead to something called the backfire effect or the boomerang effect, and that forces people to actually dismiss what you're saying even more. So instead, if someone does bring up, let's say, a myth or a rumor that they've heard that they believe, it's more important to then pivot, and what I would say essentially focusing on the disease. Talk about severity of the disease, talk about susceptibility of the disease. And the unfortunate side effect of COVID, which I think will help with acceptance, is that now most people know someone that has been infected, affected, or has had COVID. And so as a result, I think it's much more important for us to pivot and think about risk perception. The other piece I would say here is thinking about something called presumptive communication or nudges or defaults, meaning that vaccination should be the norm, right? We should assume that individuals are going to vaccinate. We have tested this in a number of settings, and we have found that because it is the standard practice, we should assume that people are going to vaccinate. The last thing I would say, and Dee touched upon this as well, is this idea of building trust through empathy. As I mentioned before, we have been living in this space for a year. I think people are really scared. People want to get back to hugging loved ones and seeing families. And so this, I cannot, I think, stress enough. How do we be empathetic when people do have concerns and they have questions? How do we continue to be a calm and supportive voice so people feel as though that they're really being listened to? If we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk just very briefly about some of the appeals in terms of communication that we have tested and that we have tried. So one appeal that we have found, for example, is really looking at this idea that you should communicate that people should get the vaccine because it's for the benefit of the community. And what I mean by that is that you essentially say, in this case, the desired behavior, which is getting a vaccine, is not just an individual choice, but it's important for the public good. So that if you get the vaccine, you're decreasing risk of exposure to other folks, such as your family or other loved ones in your community, for example. And some of these, in terms of how this started trending, I think in terms of some of these hashtags earlier on in the pandemic, were things like stay home, save lives, flatten the curve. If we go to the next slide, Another piece that we have been seeing is this idea of appealing to aspirational norms. So I do a lot of my work is based in Baltimore, and then it's based overseas, primarily in India, Afghanistan, and a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And what we have been finding is when we have been promoting non-pharmaceutical interventions, such as mask wearing, for example, we found that certain populations, certain men, for example, in some of these countries, did not want to wear a mask because they did not feel that it was masculine. So one of the ways that we have been testing this is looking at how do we appeal to aspirational norms. So essentially looking to leaders that are wearing the mask, showing that wearing the mask is the right thing to do, and that it does not essentially detract from masculinity. We go to the next slide. Great. Another appeal that we have tested and tried from a communication perspective is this idea that when you ask people to do something, i.e. get the vaccine, you want to make sure it's concise, it's uncategorical, and it's not ambiguous. So here's an example. Pretend that you have a shared kitchen with colleagues, and there is a sign above the sink that says, clean after yourself, right? Perfectly. It's a message, I think, that is clear. However, what is the problem? What is the way in which that we could really strengthen this message? One way we could do that is we could say instead, do not leave dirty dishes in the sink. It's concise, it's uncategorical, and it's not ambiguous. And so it's important for us to do this also when we communicate about vaccines. I think next slide, please. The other piece, very much in relation to appealing to community values and benefits, is thinking about the ways in which we can connect with people so they can connect with their communities. And these are just some examples here, as you can see. So be a good ancestor, keep our communities healthy, our families matter. So really appealing to the familial aspect as to why individuals should engage in this behavior, as well as this protecting our communities is our priority. So really appealing to community values to get people to engage in the desired behavior. If we go to the next slide. I think I'm turning it back over to Dee to give us a bit of an update as to where we are with regards to vaccine uptake in Native nations. So back over to you, Dee. I hope you can connect.
Thank you. I think I'm good now. I'm going to keep my camera off just to help. So where are we? Many people might know Abigail Egohawk. She is the director of the Seattle Indian Health Board and pretty vocal on social media about health that affects natives. And so she got her vaccine and put out this really nice picture for the love of Native people. And I think that's many people can agree that that's why they would get vaccinated. So when we were talking about vaccine rollout and confidence and uptake and who's getting vaccinated, sometimes in other communities, what we've heard is that vaccine hesitancy has turned into vaccine access. So people are not as hesitant to get the vaccine, but now they're wanting it and wanting to know where to get it and sometimes not being able to. And so what happened with tribes is we had the ability to determine our own prioritization for rollout and how to give our community access. And I know for my Pueblo, for example, we had a choice to go with the state or with IHS rollout, and we decided to go with IHS rollout. Other tribes are doing it a little bit differently and very successfully. And so, for example, some tribes like Cherokee and Standing Rock, they put native language speakers at the forefront of the line rather than say just people 65 and older. And then in Navajo Nation, they included their traditional practitioners working at their IHS facilities in that first top tier of healthcare workers that were vaccinated. And as we are speaking, vaccine has now changed to be open to all adults, 16 and plus for Pfizer, 18 plus for Moderna in many tribal communities. And that's really exciting to see. So more people have access. Here is vaccine coverage in some Native communities. So here's how the Navajo Nation compares to other states. And this is just all people in the state, not necessarily broken down by any other demographic. And so people who live on the Navajo Nation more people have gotten the vaccine there compared to 15% in Alaska, 14 in Minnesota, 14 in Colorado, and 12 in the United States in general. And so they've done really, really well with vaccine rollout. And here are some other tribes who have done it, and here's some articles about what they've done and how they were able to be so successful. This last photo is from the Navajo Nation Department of Health, and this is from February 23rd, so it's not the most recent, but this was when we last had data. So they thankfully have distributed many doses, and of that, they've distributed most of the vaccines that they've distributed. They've given many doses of that, and the amount of people who are fully immunized, so that they got their first and second dose, is extremely high. So it's really exciting to see, especially since they're one of the tribes that were hit really hard with COVID-19, as many tribes were, and other communities. In New Mexico, Natives actually have the highest vaccine coverage of any racial or ethnic group. I think this is kind of misleading because Natives are not necessarily a racial or ethnic group, though we're lumped in there sometimes. We're political entities that have been racialized, and that being said, it is really nice to see our data being represented, because when you do a quick search of vaccine uptake, Natives are often not included at all in those data sets. So in New Mexico, it's really exciting to see that when we're included, and we are really, really high. So the light shaded bars here are people who have received their first dose of vaccine, and the darker shaded bars are people who have received their second dose. And so we're getting better. Almost all folks are vaccinated at this point, are getting their second dose. And then just to reiterate the important role of CHRs in promoting vaccine confidence and rollout. In my pueblo, it's the CHRs who are contacting people to see if they're interested in vaccine, putting them on a list for IHS, making sure they get to their appointment, pulling other people in if they are not able to make their appointment, that kind of stuff. And so even outside of the communication, just the logistical part of it, you play a really important role. And so, as mentioned before, we can help turn vaccine questions or hesitancy into vaccine confidence to help avoid vaccine refusal. And it's so important that it come from someone who is trusted in the community. And because you work on usually the CHRs are part of the community, there's strength in appealing to community values or aspirational norms. And when confidence is built, then CHRs can help facilitate access. And so that's the logistical piece that I was just talking about. And, vaccines are now our best tool to fight COVID-19 in the community. And so we started out, I think, with shutdowns and closing our pueblos or our tribes to people who don't live here or who are not from here, and really limiting access in and out. And so I think that helped a lot in the beginning, but now we really, really need folks to be vaccinated. And then I'll turn it over to Sophie for some FAQ.
Okay. So first of all, I would like to reiterate some of the things that Dee and Rupali said about addressing misinformation. And really something that rang very true for me is that sometimes it's important to just listen to folks and let them, talk through their worries and their fears about the vaccination. And then to really steer the conversation onto the disease rather than trying to combat every piece of misinformation. But still, it can be really helpful to understand common questions that folks have to be able to help them make informed decisions. So we're going to go through a few questions and myths, try to bust all the myths we can, and then launch straight into the FAQ section. So the first question that I've heard a lot is, will the mRNA vaccines change my genes? And the answer is no. mRNA isn't the same as DNA. So just for a quick explanation, DNA is basically our genetic code. It, in a sense, determines who we are. And of course, it would be really scary to think that some vaccine would change our genetic code. but that's not the case. The COVID-19 vaccines do not change our DNA. mRNA is kind of like what you could call a little text message that your body can send to your cells, and those cells will then produce proteins. So basically what the mRNA vaccine is doing is it's telling your body to produce the spike protein, which is just a tiny little element of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, an element that cannot make you sick, but then your body can generate antibodies to be able to fight the real virus when it comes into your body. And it's also really important to understand that this mRNA is really fragile. So within 3 days, it will be fully degraded and not present in your body anymore. So no, the mRNA vaccines will not change your genes. A second common question we get is, can we choose which vaccine you want to get? And well, unfortunately, we are at a level of scarcity and our vaccine supplies are still limited. So sometimes people won't be able to make the choice of whether to get the Moderna, the Pfizer, or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I'm sorry for the squeaky toys. My puppy is going crazy in the background. But in any case, it's very important to note that Navajo Nation and tribal nations across the states will only use vaccines that the FDA has authorized as safe and effective. Next slide. All right, next question. Can vaccines cause SARS-CoV-2 infection or cause COVID-19? And the answer to that is a resounding no. So vaccines are basically made from synthetic pieces copied from SARS-CoV-2. So basically just little components, not the whole virus. So vaccines cannot cause infection or cause you to get COVID-19. And a really nice analogy that our incredible infectious disease team has prepared is that, you know, there are a bunch of parts in a car, but say like a steering wheel and a tire, and I don't even know what that is, probably like the speedometer, don't make a whole car, even though sometimes we all wish it would, because everybody, yes, you know, it would be easy if you could just get a car by purchasing those components, but that's not the case. And for the vaccine as well, you know, a lot of the vaccines sort of include spike proteins or mRNA that causes your body to generate the spike proteins. And those spike proteins are very essential for our body to recognize SARS-CoV-2, but they do not cause the disease. So they're just components, not the whole virus. Next slide. All right. Next question. This is one of my favorites because we get that a lot, and I think a lot of people have questions. Do I still need to wear a mask and practice social distancing after being vaccinated? And the answer is yes for now. We all need to do our part and continue to wear masks in public, stay safe, stay socially distanced until most of our community has been protected and COVID-19 rates are really low. So there's still a little bit of research to be done there, or a little lot of research to be done. We do know that, you know, getting the vaccine will reduce your risk of transmitting the virus, but for now we all have to stay socially distanced until we know more and our community has been protected. All right, next question. If I've been vaccinated and I get sick with COVID-19 symptoms, do I need to get tested? And the answer to that question is yes. So we know that the vaccine is very effective, especially for Pfizer and Moderna. Effectiveness is around 95%, but that is not 100%, right? So if you have COVID-19 symptoms, it's really important that you get tested as soon as possible. Next slide. Oh, wait, one question to address in the slide before. I think a lot of times, things I've been hearing is people asking, if I do get COVID-19 symptoms and a positive test, is that from the vaccine? And the answer to that is no. You will not test positive if you've gotten the vaccine. So next slide. Will the vaccine be effective for all COVID-19 strains? So the available data suggests that the vaccines will work against the variants of the virus which are circulating in the US now. But vaccine makers have started preparing for the possibility of updating vaccines to protect against emerging strains. And it's possible that updated vaccines could be given as booster doses. It's really important to emphasize that the mRNA technology used for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines will make this fairly easy and straightforward and a quick turnaround process. So next question would be, why not just take my chances with COVID-19? Why not just, get it, get over it? And the answer to that is that, vaccines do have some adverse effects. As Dee was talking about, some people feel weak, some people have, mild fevers after getting vaccinated. But getting COVID-19 is the far more dangerous option. So, there are a lot of people who are high risk, who are old, maybe obese, have other health problems, who could become severely ill and also have long-term consequences from getting COVID-19. And we even know that as much as 1 in 3 people who recover from COVID have chronic complaints. So COVID vaccines, in contrast, has very little known risk and very little known long-term risks. Next slide. This is a great question. How does the vaccine stop transmission? And here you can see a little graphic. And if I can explain the first graphic on the left, the little red people are the people who have been infected. And as you can see, like this large red person has infected many other people in their circle, and those people in turn have infected other people in their circle. None of these people have been vaccinated in this diagram, so everybody is susceptible. Everybody can get the COVID-19 disease. So now on the graphic to the right, we see a picture of a community that is partially vaccinated. So the little green people are all people who've been vaccinated. We get a person who has COVID-19 in the center, and that person is surrounded by a bunch of green people and cannot give the virus to the green people. So in this case, only one other person who may not have gotten the vaccine yet or hadn't been able to get the vaccine yet got infected. Okay, next slide. All right, so those were all the FAQs we got for you. There are a bunch more myths, and we are happy to answer any questions in the chat. Big thank you to UNM. Big thank you to everyone for having us. This was a really fun presentation. I would really like to thank my co-presenters, Dee and Rupali, for doing such incredible jobs. I would also like to thank the Johns Hopkins Infectious Disease team, especially Annie Long, Brooke Fahrenkopf, and Laura Hammett, who were on the call and really helped us prepare this presentation. I would also like to thank the training team at Johns Hopkins for facilitating this event. And we really hope that you guys have questions and are happy to answer them all in the chat. Yotwa.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sophie, Rupali, and Dion. That was a wonderful presentation. The next part that we're going to do is we're going to move into this case-based presentation role-playing piece. And I want you guys, so before we go into the breakout rooms, I loved that one slide about the role of CHRs in promoting vaccine confidence and rollout. And I think that, so I want you to think about that in your mind when you go into your breakout rooms. They brought up these points around communication and how you can, as CHRs and educators, turn vaccine questions or hesitancy into vaccine confidence. And so, think about your strengths, think about moving into those aspirational norms, how you work as CHRs out in the field from an empathy level, from that listening level. And as you dialogue in your role playing, think about those strengths that you have, to move that conversation forward. So Paige, tag teaming it to you, girl.